The first thing you notice is the temperature. Even in a public gallery, even under lights that are meant to be gentle, a clay tablet seems to hold a coolness of its own, as if it is still remembering the ground it came from. The surface is not smooth. It is fine-grained and slightly uneven, like dried riverbank mud. And when you lean close enough to see the wedge marks clearly, the cuneiform stops looking like writing and begins to look like pressure, thousands of tiny decisions pressed into a soft material that once gave way, then hardened, then survived. This is not what most people imagine when they hear the phrase, the Lost Book of Enki. A book suggests pages, a spine, a title that someone can point to and say, here it is, or here it is missing. But the older the story gets, the less it behaves like a book, and the more it behaves like a shelf after an earthquake. Shards, joins, fragments, copies, rival versions, and the quiet certainty that something once whole is now scattered. Tonight, for a while, I want you to sit with the possibility that the Lost Book of Enki was never a single object to begin with, that it was a pattern, a set of messages preserved in clay, passed through hands that did not claim to invent what they held, but to transmit it, and that the very act of preservation, copying, filing, storing, teaching, may be the most important clue of all. If you're listening to this as you settle down, take a moment and leave a comment telling me where in the world you are and what time it is there for. Not because it changes the past, but because it reminds us how far these words travel and how quietly they endure. On one of the most famous Sumerian flood fragments in the Penn Museum, catalogued as CBS 10673, joined with CBS 10867, the museum's own description tells us what the preserved lines concern. Creation of humans, Prediluvian cities and their rulers, and then a flood, planned by the gods, revealed by Enki to a king named Ziusudra, with wind and storms, and 7 days and 7 nights of water, followed by sacrifice and a grant of life beyond ordinary limits. And there is something else in that description, something that belongs to the mood of our title, because this tablet is not complete. It is the lower portion, only a surviving third, of something that would have been longer, with many more lines, many more choices of wording, many more opportunities for detail. In the clay itself, you can feel the absence. A break line is not just a missing edge, it is a missing voice. So when a modern phrase says Sumerian records they didn't want preserved, we should not rush to imagine a single villain with a torch. In Mesopotamian history, loss is often quieter than that. Loss is a collapsed wall, a library room that becomes a mound, a tablet that falls face down and is not retrieved before the roof comes in. Loss is the simple fact that clay survives best when it is buried, and least when it is treasured on a shelf. And yet, despite all of that, this fragment remained. It travelled from Nippur to a museum collection. It was given an object number. It was photographed, measured, described. It was identified as a flood tablet, deluge tablet. And in that act, cataloguing what remains, we perform something that the ancient scribes themselves understood, that survival is not a miracle, it is a practice. A reed stylus makes a wedge, a scribe repeats a line, a student copies a composition, a priest stores a tablet in a room near a temple court, a city falls, the tablets sink into dust, and centuries later someone lifts them back into light. If a lost book of Enki ever existed, it may exist in this kind of survival, not as a single intact text, but as a braided record, threads crossing centuries, repeating certain structures, leaving certain gaps, and carrying forward one persistent image. Enki is the one who knows. Enki is the one who speaks when others are silent. Enki is the one who, in story after story, appears at the threshold between destruction and continuity. Mainstream scholarship often treats these as literary myth, an imaginative explanation for disasters, a sacred narrative, a teaching tool in scribal schools. That reading is careful, and it has strong reasons. The tablet is written in Sumerian, but the copy we have is Old Babylonian in date, long after the earliest phases of Sumerian city life. It is a text that students could learn, that scribes could recite, that communities could adapt, but there is also a second reading, quieter and harder to dismiss. Because the tablet does not present itself as a fairy tale. It presents itself as a record, cities named, rulers implied, divine decisions written like administrative decrees, and a warning delivered not as a thunderclap, but as information passed to a specific person, a king, a survivor, a man whose name Ziusudra belongs to a chain of flood survivors across Mesopotamian literature, changing languages as it moves, but keeping the same outline: warning, boat, storm, bird, sacrifice, and altered fate. What if that is the point? What if, for the scribes who copied these lines, the core act was not invention, but preservation, holding a memory of rupture so that it could be carried through the next restoration? Because once you accept that possibility, the title becomes less sensational and more precise. The records they didn't want preserved may not be a plot at all. It may be a tension between what temples keep, what kings promote, what empires standardize, what schools copy, and what time erases anyway. And the moment you begin to look at it that way, one broken tablet in a museum becomes a door. Not a door into certainty, a door into a method. We begin where clay survives. We follow the proveniences, Nippur, Sippar, Nineveh. We follow the catalogue numbers, because catalogue numbers are modern, but the objects are real. We listen to what the texts actually say, and we notice what they refuse to explain. And slowly, without forcing conclusions, we begin to see what a lost book might be in a world where books, as we know them, did not yet exist. A scattered archive, a tradition of copying, a set of stories that keep returning to the same quiet claim that knowledge can be inherited, that civilization can be restored, that after catastrophe something remains, not because it is new, but because it was carried. And if that is true, then the first question is not who tried to destroy it. The first question is simpler and in some ways more unsettling. Who decided to copy it? Because somewhere in the long chain between the flood and the museum case, someone looked at these words and chose to press them again into wet clay, knowing that the clay would harden, and knowing, perhaps, that one day the rest might break away. And still they wrote. This raises the question of where such writing lived before it broke, what kind of rooms held it, what kind of city kept it, and why one place in particular keeps returning like a refrain whenever we speak of preserved Sumerian memory. Nippur. Nippur's deep shelves. How a city stores memory. Nippur does not charm the imagination the way Ur or Babylon does. Ur is a name people recognize. Babylon has a shadow that reaches into later traditions. But Nippur, in many popular tellings, becomes merely a dot, a place where tablets were found. In reality, that is already enough to matter, because in Mesopotamia, a provenience is not a footnote. It is a clue about institutions, about who wrote, who stored, who taught, who archived, and who believed that words pressed into clay were worth keeping close to a temple wall. When we say that the flood tablet CBS 10673 comes from Nippur, we are saying that it comes from a city that was, for long periods, a religious and scribal centre, closely associated with the great temple complex of Enlil. It is the kind of place where kings sought legitimacy, where priests managed ritual, and where scribes preserved tradition. And that creates an immediate tension that fits our title. Enki, in many texts, is not Enlil. Enki is the lord of the Abzu, the deep waters, the keeper of craft and wisdom. Enlil is the great mountain, the authority whose decisions feel like the axis of order. If a text that features Enki as the one who reveals a divine plan is being copied at Nippur, in the orbit of Enlil's cultic landscape, then preservation is already complicated. Not forbidden, complicated. Mainstream interpretation would say this is normal. Mesopotamian religion is not a single doctrine. Scribes copied many compositions. Cities carried multiple cults and myths. The fact that an Enki-centered narrative exists in an Enlil-associated city does not imply conflict. It implies the breadth of a learned tradition. That is true as far as it goes. But if we look more closely at what Nippur represents, we see why a lost book would not be one book at all. It would be a library practice. The CDLI record for the flood tablet witness, P265876, tells us something quietly important. It identifies the museum number as CBS 10673 plus CBS 10867, and it anchors the provenience as Nippur. It also links to early publication history, including Arno Pobil's work from 1914. What that means, in practical terms, is that the object belongs to a modern chain of scholarship, and that chain begins with excavation and collection. The tablet was not found as a neat item on a shelf. It was recovered from a site that had become layered with time, and this is where we must slow down, because preservation in Mesopotamia often happens through destruction. Clay tablets survive best when they are accidentally baked, when a building burns, when a wall collapses, when an archive is sealed. A tablet left in a damp environment can soften and degrade. But a tablet fired by heat becomes ceramic. It becomes stubborn. It resists decay. So an archive can be saved by disaster, and a lost book can be preserved by the very forces that unmake a city. If the title suggests that someone did not want these records preserved, the deeper reality may be that no one could fully control preservation at all. People controlled copying. They controlled which texts students learned. They controlled what was stored in temple rooms, but the earth controlled what survived. In Nippur, the earth kept many things: administrative tablets, lexical lists, literary compositions, school exercises, hymns, myths, king lists, flood stories, instructions, prayers, and each category of text tells a different story about what knowledge meant. Administrative tablets are immediate: grain, labour, deliveries. They show the city as a machine. Literary tablets are slower. They show the city as memory. A flood text is not a receipt. It is a boundary marker between eras. It is the kind of narrative that can justify why kingship changes hands, why the world must be reordered, why the present is always a restoration of something older. In a city like Nippur, that kind of story has a function. It provides a frame for authority. It offers a reason for ritual. It teaches scribes that words can outlast walls. But there is also something else. Because when you read the Penn Museum's description of CBS 1673, it says the text deals with pre-Diluvian cities and their rulers, and then moves into the flood. Pre-Diluvian cities and rulers. Before the flood, cities exist. Before the flood, kingship exists. Before the flood, there is already an order worth recording. This is one of the most persistent patterns across Mesopotamian tradition, the idea that civilization does not begin once, cleanly, in one moment of invention. It begins, is interrupted, and begins again. To a modern ear, this can sound like mythic embellishment. To a Mesopotamian scribe, it can sound like the simplest way to speak about ruin and renewal. What if the Sumerians preserved knowledge rather than invented it? If you were a scribe in an old Babylonian school, copying a Sumerian composition that speaks of pre-Diluvian cities, you might not be claiming that you personally witnessed those times. You might be claiming something else, that your city's order is inherited, that the rituals you perform are restorations, that the names you write down matter because they belong to a chain older than you. In that sense, Nippur is not simply a place where tablets were found. It is a place where continuity was manufactured through copying. So the Lost Book of Enki becomes, in our hands, a question about institutions. Who keeps a story alive? Who decides which texts are canonical enough to be copied? Who preserves a god's role in the narrative of survival? Because in the flood tablets description, Enki is not the destroyer, Enki is the informant. Enki is the one who reveals the plan. And if that role persists in multiple traditions, across multiple cities, it is not because one tablet survived. It is because many scribes decided that this role mattered. The pattern extends beyond Nippur into other kinds of official narratives, some carved on prisms, written for legitimacy, and containing a line so blunt and simple that it sounds almost like a clerk's note. The flood swept over, and after it, kingship returns. When kingship descended, the official story that still admits a break. There is a particular kind of object that wants to be turned in the hand. Not a tablet, flat and palm-sized, but a prism, tall, narrow, and meant to be read by rotating it slowly, face by face, as if the text was circling a central axis. A prism asks you to move around it. It forces patience. It creates a rhythm, read a column, shift your grip, let the light slide across the wedges, read again. On the well-Blundell prism, the Sumerian king list, a clay prism now kept in Oxford, history does not begin with a date. It begins with a descent. Kingship, it tells us, did not originate as a human invention. It descended from heaven. The list gives cities, rulers, and reign lengths that stretch beyond ordinary measures. And then, at a certain point, the narrative breaks with a sentence that feels almost too brief for what it implies. The flood swept over, not a poem, not a lament, a line like a door closing. And then another sentence, another descent, another restoration. After the flood had swept over and kingship had descended from heaven, the pace is calm, but the idea is enormous. A world is washed clean. Authority returns. The story continues as if interruption is part of the design. Mainstream interpretation treats the king list as a work of political theology, an ideological text, stitched together from memory, legend, and historical tradition, used by later rulers to legitimize themselves as heirs to a single chain of dominion. It is not history in the modern sense, it is a structure of meaning. The list organizes the past so that the present can seem inevitable. That reading is solid. It matches what we know about Mesopotamian kingship, how rulers framed themselves as chosen, sanctioned, placed into office by divine decision. The list's later sections move toward more realistic reign lengths, and the whole composition has the feel of a tradition that folds myth and record together without apology. But there is a detail that deserves to be held quietly without rushing past it. If the king list were merely a convenient story to elevate one dynasty over another, it did not need to include a flood at all. A flood is not politically convenient. A flood creates uncertainty. A flood suggests collapse, archives lost, cities erased, kings drowned, temples unserved, boundaries blurred, order interrupted. In ideological terms, it is a confession that even kingship can be swept away, and yet the line remains. The text preserves the rupture as if the rupture itself is part of the legitimacy. It is here that our core thesis can be held up to the light. What if the Sumerians preserved knowledge rather than invented it? In the king list, kingship does not begin once, it returns. Civilization is not a single upward climb, it is a rebuilding, a restoration, a reinstallation of something older that has been interrupted. That is not proof of any literal global catastrophe. It is not proof of a single historical flood, in the way modern argument demands proof, but it is a very clear indication of how Mesopotamian scribes wanted the world to be understood, as a place where destruction has already happened, where continuity is fragile, and where the central work of culture is to re-establish order after a break. The flood tablet from Nippur, the one that speaks of Enki warning Yisodra, belongs to the same mental architecture. It too assumes that cities existed before a great rupture, and that someone carried forward what mattered. So here, at the level of official tradition, we find something that resembles what people want when they say a lost book, a sense that there is an older layer beneath the layer we can see, a conviction that the present is not original but inherited. Now there is an easy temptation at this point to imagine censors and erasures, to imagine a deliberate campaign to remove the wrong version of events. But in Mesopotamia, the mechanism is often subtler than removal. It is selection. A scribe in a school chooses which compositions are copied again this year. A temple administrator decides what belongs in an archive room near the sanctuary. A royal scholar assembles a library that reflects an empire's identity. A later king prizes one god's perspective over another. None of this requires a bonfire. It only requires time and the simple reality that clay tablets are copied by hand. So when the title says Sumerian records they didn't want preserved, we can translate it into something more precise and more historically grounded. Which records were copied and which were not? Which narratives were privileged by later centres of power? Which gods were allowed to remain central and which were reframed? Because in the king list, kingship descends from heaven, a phrase that can be read as sacred metaphor, or as a claim of cosmic legitimacy, or as an inherited formula repeated because it is ancient. But either way, it positions authority as something received, not created. And once you accept that premise, you begin to recognise it elsewhere, especially in the traditions that revolve around Enki. Enki is not primarily a warrior in these narratives. He is not the one who conquers. He is the one who knows the patterns beneath the surface. He is the one associated with the Abzu, the deep fresh waters below the earth. And even that image carries a philosophy that the source of life and of wisdom is beneath what you see. If the Lost Book of Enki exists as a theme, it may be this, that beneath the public story of kingship, beneath the official list of reigns, there is a quieter story about who holds the knowledge that makes restoration possible. And when you begin to look for that story, you find that it is not told on a single tablet. It is distributed. It appears in compositions that read like hymns, inventories and decrees, texts that describe order itself, as if order were a thing that can be assigned, measured, allocated, and kept. That leads us naturally to a different kind of evidence, less overtly historical, but in some ways more revealing. A Sumerian composition in which Enki speaks of decisions and functions and the placement of powers, where the world is organised as if it were an archive, and where, for a moment, the language almost sounds like a confession. I brought the arts and crafts and placed them, not invented them, carried them. Enki's inventory of the world, order as a form of remembering. Imagine a place where writing is not primarily used to tell stories. Imagine a place where writing is used to keep things from drifting apart. In Mesopotamia, that is not imagination for long. It is what the tablets show again and again: lists of grain, lists of workers, lists of offerings, lists of names, lists of stars. An instinct to name, to register, to fix in clay what would otherwise pass through the mouth and disappear into air. Now imagine that instinct lifted into the realm of myth and theology, where the world itself is treated as something that can be administered. That is the atmosphere of the composition known as Enki and the World Order. It survives not as one neat original, but as a composite tradition assembled from multiple manuscripts, multiple copies, from scribal contexts, preserved in fragments, stitched into a scholarly whole. Even the survival pattern feels like the message. The text itself is an ordered reconstruction. In this composition, Enki is praised as Lord of the Abzu, and the text presents him as one who establishes decisions, who regulates time, who assigns functions, who brings prosperity into place, not by brute force, but by distributing roles and duties across the world. Mainstream scholarship reads this as mythic literature that encodes a social reality. The Sumerian world understood itself as a network of cities, professions, rituals and divine jurisdictions. Me, the divine powers or cultural ordinances, are not just magical items. They are a way of speaking about what makes civilization feel stable: kingship, priesthood, crafts, justice, weaving, building, music, and the countless practices that transform a floodplain into a city. That interpretation is careful and convincing. But there is an overlooked detail that becomes striking when you place this text beside the flood tradition. Because in Enki and the world order, Enki does not present himself as the inventor of the world's order. He presents himself as the custodian of it. He speaks of powers gathered and placed, of arts brought from one house to another, of decisions submitted to assemblies, of destinies decreed in appointed places. The language repeatedly implies transfer, management, stewardship, and that is exactly what preserving knowledge looks like. If we allow ourselves a speculative reading, clearly labelled as speculation, not certainty, the composition begins to resemble the outline of a lost book in the title's sense. Not a book hidden away, but a set of statements about how order is obtained. What if the text suggests that Enki's defining role is not creation out of nothing, but restoration, taking something that exists in a more primordial form and making it usable in the human world? Consider the way the Absu functions as an image. The Absu is beneath, it is hidden, it is the deep source. Enki, as lord of the Absu, becomes the one who draws up what is below and distributes it above. In a floodplain civilization, where the very land can vanish under water and return again, this image is not abstract, it is lived. The river rises, fields vanish, canals break, silt settles, water recedes, and the land returns, altered but usable again if someone remembers where the boundaries were, where the ditches ran, where the old markers stood. In that practical sense, the work of civilization is always an act of remembering. So when Enki is portrayed as the one who fixes destinies and assigns roles, we can read it as a divine mirror of what scribes and administrators did every day, maintaining continuity against the erasing power of water and time. This does not prove that Enki was a literal historical figure. It does not prove that the Mi are records from a lost civilization. It does not prove a secret suppression. But it does raise a question that fits the title's promise without leaving the ground of evidence. Why does Enki, across traditions, appear at points where the world must be reordered? Why does his authority feel like knowledge, like something held and transmitted, rather than like simple force? And why, in the flood tradition, is he the one who chooses to inform the survivor? A mainstream view might answer, because Enki is a trickster, a wise god, a counterbalance to Enlil's severity, the myth needs a saviour figure within the pantheon. That is one possible reading. But another possibility, still grounded in what the text suggests, is that these compositions preserve a cultural memory of how fragile order is, and of how essential it is that someone carries the plan forward when catastrophe comes. That plan might be practical, how to rebuild, how to measure, how to assign labour, how to restore ritual, how to re-establish the calendar. Or it might be something deeper, how to keep a society's identity intact when the world breaks. And in that sense, Enki and the world order is not merely a myth about the cosmos, it is a myth about archives, about the idea that order lives in records, and that records must be protected, copied, and carried. From this angle, the flood tradition becomes less like a simple disaster tale and more like a test of transmission. A world is to be erased. Someone warns one person. A boat is built. A future is preserved. The pattern appears again, in a different way, on the Nippur flood fragment, where the description tells us plainly that Enki reveals the plan to Ziusudra. And if you listen carefully, you can almost hear the administrative tone behind the miracle. A plan, a disclosure, a set of instructions, a survival protocol, which means that the next step in our investigation is not to leap to cosmic conclusions, but to return to that fragment and treat it like what it is, a surviving portion of a larger record with specific claims about pre-flood cities. divine decisions, and a carefully measured duration of catastrophe. If a lost book exists here, it may exist in the missing upper portion, in the lines we do not have, in what might have been said before the break. And that absence, more than any dramatic claim, may be the truest reason people feel that something was not meant to be preserved. Because what is broken always invites the question, what was written above? The flood that has two voices, Ziusudra and the quiet informant. The fragment is small enough that the mind wants to complete it. You see the surviving lower portion, you see the neat columns of text, and you begin to imagine the missing upper third as if it was still hovering in the air above the break. That is one of the strangest powers of cuneiform fragments. They do not only show what was written, they show what was lost. And in a story about a lost book, that absence is not a flaw, it is part of the evidence. The Penn Museum's flood tablet fragment, CBS 10673, joined with CBS 1867, is described as having 6 columns of text, 3 on each side, and the complete tablet would probably have carried around 260 lines. What survives is the lower third. That proportion matters. It means we are standing inside a story, not at its beginning. We enter after decisions have already been made, and in the museum's description, those decisions carry an unsettling clarity. Divine instructions to humanity include the building of cities under the protectorship of specific deities. Prediluvian cities and their rulers are named. There is an established world before the flood, a world organised enough to be recorded. Then comes the plan, the gods' decision to destroy the human race by means of a flood. And then, very quietly, another movement within the divine realm. Enki reveals the plan to Ziusudra, the king, and urges him to heed his advice. This is the point where many modern tellings become dramatic and fast and absolute. But the tablet itself, at least as the surviving description gives it, does not need that energy. It only needs the bare fact that knowledge is not evenly distributed among the gods. One god knows the plan, one god chooses to disclose it. One human becomes the carrier of continuity. Mainstream scholarship often reads this as a literary structure, the tension between divine decree and divine compassion. It is a way of thinking about why catastrophe happens at all and why survival is never random. It is also a way of teaching values, that wisdom can be aligned with mercy, that the world contains forces that destroy and forces that preserve, and that the human being who listens, who obeys, who prepares, becomes worthy of special fate. That interpretation is coherent and deeply Mesopotamian. It fits the worldview where gods are not a single unified will, but an assembly, and where destinies are debated, decided, and sometimes contested. But there is an overlooked procedural detail in the way the story is framed. The flood is not simply sent like weather. It is planned. It is announced within the divine sphere. It is treated like a decision with an internal logic, and Enki's role is not to stop it outright, but to move information across a boundary, from the council of gods into the ear of a man. What if that is the true shape of the lost book of Enki in Sumerian memory? Not a forbidden codex, but a recurring motif, Enki as the keeper of privileged information, and humanity as dependent on transmission. If we keep our language careful, we can say this much with confidence. The text tradition places Enki at the hinge where knowledge becomes survival. The tablet's description is explicit. Enki reveals the plan. The flood lasts 7 days and 7 nights. The sun returns. The survivor emerges and offers sacrifices. Anan-Enlil grants Yasudra eternal life. The pattern is formal, almost ritual. Instruction, catastrophe, emergence, offering, altered fate. And the 7 days and 7 nights are not a random flourish. In Mesopotamian thought, measured time matters. Calendars, months in their houses, festivals scheduled precisely. These are not minor details in this world. The fact that catastrophe is given a counted duration suggests the mind of a scribe, and of a culture that believes order is maintained by measurement. That is where a speculative possibility becomes quietly plausible? What if the story is preserving not only an imagined flood, but a memory of what it feels like when order collapses, and of what it takes to restore it? In the aftermath of a real flood on the Mesopotamian plain, the practical problems are not poetic. They are administrative. Boundaries are gone, canals are broken, seed stores are soaked, herds are scattered, people are displaced, temples must be repaired, labour must be reassigned, the calendar of offerings must restart. In a world like that, the most valuable thing is not a new invention, it is a remembered system. The old measurements, the old schedules, the old names of fields, the old duties of offices, the old sequence of rites. So when the flood story places a wise god in the role of revealer and guide, it can be read as the divine image of a scribal reality. Survival requires a plan, and a plan requires someone to carry it. That does not prove that the Sumerians were preserving knowledge from an antediluvian civilization in the literal modern sense. It does not prove that the flood was global. It does not prove that any later authority attempted to erase a book, but it does suggest that in the Sumerian imagination and in the scribal tradition that copied this text, the most sacred act is not creation from nothing. It is continuity through rupture. And now, with this in mind, the title becomes sharper. The Lost Book of Enki, Sumerian records they didn't want preserved. If such records exist, the pen fragment shows us what they might look like. An account where divine authority is not a single voice, where the official plan is destruction, and where the survival of humanity depends on a channel of knowledge that is, by nature, selective. Not everyone is told. One person is told. And that creates a shadow, because once you have a story like this, you can't help but ask, what else was told, and to whom, in other cities, in other archives, in other languages? The pattern does not remain confined to Nippur. It travels, it changes names, it shifts the divine caste slightly, and it reappears in a different place, on a different tablet, under a different catalogue number, still preserving the same core mechanism, a flood, a warning, and a survivor who becomes a living archive. But this time, the city is Sippar, the language is Akkadian, and the politics of preservation feel different. Sippar's flood tablet, a second archive, a second proof of transmission. Sippar sits in the mind like a different kind of light. Nippur is often imagined as interior, temple-bound, a place of tradition and authority. Sippar, by contrast, is associated in many texts with the sun god, with law, with clear seeing, with the idea that justice is a kind of illumination. Even if that mental picture is shaped by later associations, the point remains, Sippar is not Nippur. And that is what makes the British Museum's Old Babylonian flood tablet from Sippar so important, because it tells us that the flood story is not a single local tradition trapped in one city's archive. It exists as a broader Mesopotamian inheritance, copied and preserved across regions and centuries, with variations that show adaptation rather than invention. The British Museum tablet BM 78941 is described in plain institutional language as the Babylonian story of the flood. It is a clay tablet, incomplete, damaged, missing its upper quarter, with a production date in the 17th century BC range. It comes from Sippar. This is not the Gilgamesh flood story yet, not the famous later library tablet that caused a sensation in the 19th century. This is an old Babylonian witness to a flood tradition closely associated with the Atrahasis epic. Mainstream scholarship tends to read Atrahasis as a sophisticated narrative about human purpose and divine human tension, humans created to relieve the gods of labour, humans multiplying and making noise, the gods attempting population control, a final decision to wipe humanity out by flood, and a survivor who is guided by a god, often Ea, the Akkadian counterpart of Sumerian Enki. The details differ, the theological emphasis differs, the language differs, but the underlying mechanism remains: a decision within the divine assembly, a disclosure by the wise god, a human instructed to build, a catastrophe measured in days, a world that resumes afterward, constrained by new rules. This is where the evidence begins to behave like a net rather than a single thread. We can cross-reference the Nippur Sumerian flood tradition and the Sippar Akkadian tradition without forcing them into one identical story. We do not need to flatten differences to claim continuity. The continuity is already present in the repeated structural elements, and that is precisely how ancient textual transmission works. Not by copying a story word for word forever, but by copying its shape, its purpose, its key images, and letting each generation of scribes translate it into the language and concerns of its own time. Now, the title's phrase, "they didn't want preserved," becomes more interesting because it pushes us to consider who they might be in a Mesopotamian context. In Sippar, the flood story is not merely a relic of Sumerian memory. It has become part of Babylonian literary culture, and Babylonian culture did not preserve Sumerian tradition as a museum piece. It preserved it as a working inheritance, sometimes reverent, sometimes re-edited, sometimes reorganized around new divine hierarchies. So, one mainstream interpretation is that there is no suppression here at all, only transformation. The Sumerian past becomes a foundation stone in later Babylonia, but it is recut to fit new architecture. That interpretation is likely correct in many cases, but transformation can feel like erasure from the inside. If an older Sumerian narrative placed Enki at the centre of the moral universe, and a later tradition reframed the story within a different theological balance, without denying Enki's role entirely, but shifting emphasis, then a person looking backward might say something was taken away. Not burned, not banned, simply deprioritized. And deprioritization over centuries can produce the same result as active destruction. A text stops being copied as often, fewer manuscripts survive, a tradition becomes known only in fragments. What remains is enough to suggest what was there, but not enough to reconstruct it fully. In this sense, the lost book is not a single missing artifact. It is the difference between what was once copied widely and what is now known only by broken pieces. BM 78941 sits inside that reality. It is an old Babylonian tablet from Sippar, damaged, incomplete, yet preserved well enough to be identified and catalogued as part of the flood tradition. It is a second archive voice from a second city carrying a cognate story, and it prepares us for the third voice, the most famous one, not because it is more true, but because its preservation was shaped by an empire with a different relationship to the past, an empire that collected, that standardized, that built libraries not merely for temples, but for kings. If a lost book can be recovered, it is often recovered there, in raw libraries, where texts from many times were gathered, recopied, and organized into something closer to a canon. And the place where that happened most famously is Nineveh, in a library associated with an Assyrian king, a library whose tablets, when rediscovered, changed the modern world's understanding of Mesopotamian literature, a library where the flood story appears again, this time in the Epic of Gilgamesh, on a tablet that is both famous and, in its own way, just as fragmentary as the rest. And once we enter Nineveh, we enter the question of preservation as a political act, not because someone is hiding a secret, but because empires preserve what they need. Nineveh's library, the flood rewritten for an empire. Nineveh is not a place you stumble into by accident. Even in ruin, even reduced to named mounds, Kuyunjik, Nebi Yunus, it carries the feeling of a capital. In the 7th century before the Common Era, the Assyrian court gathered knowledge the way it gathered tribute, systematically, widely, and with a sense that the world could be made legible by collecting it. When we speak of the library of Ashurbanipal, we tend to picture a grand room lined with shelves, a calm sanctuary of scholarship. The reality was likely more complex. Storerooms, workrooms, tablets stacked, catalogued, moved, copied, repaired, borrowed. A place where scribes did not merely preserve old texts, but actively shaped them into authoritative versions. This matters because the flood story that many modern listeners recognise, the one associated with the Epic of Gilgamesh, comes to us through that world. On the British Museum tablet K3375, the object is identified as the 11th tablet of the Epic of Gilgamesh, containing the story of the flood. It is Neo-Assyrian in date, produced in the 7th century BC, and it speaks in Akkadian. It is a later witness to an older tradition, preserved because a royal institution believed that the past belonged in its keeping. Mainstream scholarship treats the standard Babylonian Gilgamesh epic as a masterwork of Mesopotamian literature shaped over time, assembled from older Sumerian stories about Gilgamesh and reworked into a philosophical narrative about mortality. In that arc, the flood story enters as a kind of mirror, Gilgamesh seeking the secret of life, meeting the flood survivor, hearing how one human once escaped death, and realising that immortality is not a technique to be learned, but a boundary to be accepted. That is the accepted literary reading, and it has depth. But if we listen to the flood portion as an archivist would, rather than as a poet, we hear something else. We hear the persistence of a transmission mechanism. The gods decide to send a flood. One god, Ea, the Akkadian counterpart of Enki, relays the plan to the man who will survive. The man is instructed to build a boat. The flood lasts a measured number of days. The waters recede. Birds are released. A sacrifice follows. A destiny changes. These are the same bones we have already seen in the earlier traditions, even though the flesh has changed. That is what cross-generational preservation looks like. Not perfect copying, but recognisable structure. So what changes when the story passes through Nineveh? The first change is context. In Nippur and Sippar, the flood story sits close to older cosmological framing, Prediluvian cities, divine assemblies, and the logic of gods managing humanity. In Nineveh, the story becomes a narrated memory delivered inside another epic. It is embedded. It functions as testimony. The second change is audience. In scribal schools, flood stories teach language, tradition, and cultural memory. In a rural library, they become part of a state's intellectual possession. They are stored not only for education, but for authority, because an empire that collects the past also claims to stand above it. The third change is tone. The Nippur fragment, even through modern description, feels like a compressed record. Instructions, events, durations, outcomes. The Gilgamesh flood story, in its fully preserved form elsewhere, is richer in narrative detail and reflective emphasis. It is built to be heard as literature, and yet the core hinge remains. The hinge is knowledge. Without Ea's disclosure, there is no survival. This is where the title's promise can be fulfilled without leaving the ground of careful interpretation. If a lost book of Enki exists as a felt reality, it may be because Enki's role is so consistent across traditions that it begins to look like an underlying message the cultures could not let go of. Not that Enki is a secret villain or secret saviour in a simplistic sense, but that the texts repeatedly place him in the position of the keeper of instructions, of the one who knows the plan beneath the plan. Now, a mainstream scholar might argue that this is simply the nature of the god. Enki/E is the god of wisdom and the deep. Of course he knows. Of course he acts as mediator. Of course he undermines harsh decrees when necessary. It is a mythic trope, and that may be true. But it still leaves us with a question about preservation. Why did this trope survive so well? Why did scribes in different centuries, in different cities, in different languages choose to carry forward this specific distribution of divine roles? One possibility is that it served as a cultural balancing mechanism. If divine authority can destroy, divine wisdom can preserve. The world remains morally intelligible. Another possibility, more speculative, but still anchored to the evidence of repeated structure, is that this pattern preserved a memory of how survival actually worked in Mesopotamia. Not survival from cosmic floods necessarily, survival from any collapse. In war, archives are looted or burned. In drought, cities empty. In flood, boundaries vanish. In dynastic change, cults are recentered. In all of these, continuity depends on people who carry knowledge, scribes who remember how to write, priests who remember the calendar, builders who remember how to lay foundations, administrators who remember how to distribute rations. An empire like Assyria could preserve the flood story because it preserved the people and systems that kept texts alive. But that preservation comes with a cost: standardization. When a royal library collects texts, it tends to freeze versions, making one arrangement of lines more official than the rest. That does not mean the other versions are destroyed. It means they become less visible. And this is the quiet mechanism by which a lost book can be created. Not by burning, by canon making, by choosing which version is copied most, by letting other versions remain in fewer manuscripts, more fragile, more likely to vanish. So, if we imagine a Sumerian or Old Babylonian flood narrative that once contained details now missing, details perhaps about Prediluvian kingship, or about the specific instructions given, or about the role of particular cities, those details might not be suppressed in the dramatic sense. They might simply fall out of the standard tradition over centuries of copying. And the modern listener, sensing that something is missing, names the absence a lost book. It is not a foolish intuition. It is a historically reasonable one. Because Mesopotamian literature is full of lacunae, broken spaces where we know a line existed, but we do not know what it said. And once you accept that, you begin to understand why the most honest way to look for a lost text is not to chase a single artifact. It is to study how texts survive at all. Which brings us to a lesson that seems unrelated at first glance, but is actually the heart of the matter. A different composition, one that is not about flood and not centered on Enki, shows us how ancient books truly exist in this world, not as single volumes, but as constellations of copies scattered across collections, each one carrying part of the voice. The underworld has footnotes, how texts survive as constellations of copies. If you want to understand what it means for something to be lost in Mesopotamia, you don't start with a missing title, you start with a list of witnesses. In the study of cuneiform literature, a composition is rarely preserved in one perfect manuscript. More often, it survives in many fragments, some in one museum, some in another, copied in different times, with different scribal habits, with lines omitted here and added there. Scholars reconstruct a composite text the way a conservator reconstructs a shattered vessel, by aligning edges, comparing patterns, and accepting that some gaps cannot be filled. This is not a weakness of the field. It is the field. A composition like Inanna's Descent to the Netherworld survives in this exact manner. Multiple tablets, multiple proveniences, multiple collections. The cuneiform sources are catalogued across museums, including British Museum numbers and CBS numbers, among others. The composition exists because copyists kept copying it, and because enough copies survived that a modern composite could be assembled. The experience of reading such a text is unlike reading a modern book. You are always aware of the seams. You sense where the tradition is strong, where many copies overlap, and where it is fragile, where only one witness holds a line, and if that witness is broken, the line is gone. Now imagine applying this reality to the phrase, the lost book of Enki. If Enki had a book in the modern sense, it would have had to survive through a chain of copying. If it did not survive, it would not vanish like a modern lost paperback. It would fragment. Pieces would remain. Some lines would reappear embedded in other compositions. Certain motifs would persist because they were copied into school texts, hymns, myths, or ritual instructions. the book would dissolve into a tradition. And that is exactly what we are seeing. We are not searching for a single object with a title. We are following a set of recurring messages: Enki as organizer of functions, Enki as revealer of a plan, Enki as the presence at the edge of catastrophe. Inanna's descent teaches us something crucial here, not because it is about Enki, but because it demonstrates the mechanics of survival. A text can be famous and still fragile. A text can be widely copied and still broken. A text can exist in practice as an agreement among fragments, an act of reconstruction. So when people say they didn't want it preserved, we can translate it again into a more accurate, less sensational question. What kinds of texts were copied widely and what kinds were copied narrowly? Which compositions were taught in schools and which remained confined to specific temple contexts? Which narratives were compatible with later political theology and which became awkward? Because awkward texts are not necessarily destroyed, they are simply copied less. And in a world where copying is the engine of survival, less copying is a slow disappearance. The underworld in Inanna's story is a place of gates, each one requiring something to be surrendered. The textual tradition is similar. Each century has gates, changes in language, in patronage, in scribal curriculum, in political power. At each gate, some details are surrendered. The composition continues, but altered. The title remains, but the voice shifts. And now, having understood how a lost book truly looks in the Mesopotamian record, we can return to a quieter kind of preservation, one that operates not in temples or raw libraries, but in schools. Because if you want a tradition to survive, you do not only store it, you teach it. And the most powerful preservation device in ancient Mesopotamia was not the palace archive, it was the student's tablet. School tablets and quiet continuities, the ethics of remembered civilization. A school tablet is, in its own way, more intimate than a royal monument. A monument speaks outward, toward the public, toward the gods, toward the future. A school tablet speaks inward, toward the hands that shaped it. It is practice made visible, a student copying signs, a teacher correcting, a curriculum choosing which texts a young scribe should absorb until they became instinct. In the old Babylonian period, Sumerian had already become, in many contexts, a learned language, preserved, taught, copied and revered, even as Akkadian was spoken widely in daily life. This bilingual world produced a remarkable phenomenon. Sumerian literature continued to live, not as a dead relic, but as a disciplined inheritance. And among the texts that circulated in this educational environment is the Instructions of Shuruppak. It is not a flood story, not a myth of gods, not a list of kings. It is a voice of advice, an elder instructing a younger with practical warnings about behaviour, speech, work, and the unpredictable nature of fate. And within that frame, there is a detail that matters for our investigation. The figure addressed in the instructions is Ziusudra, the same name associated with the flood survivor in the Sumerian tradition. Mainstream scholarship treats this as part of the broader cultural memory. Ziusudra as a wise figure, a focal point for teachings, a name that carries authority because it is attached to survival and to antediluvian antiquity. The instructions become ethical literature, rooted in the prestige of before the flood time. This is a natural literary move. A famous name gives weight to advice. But if we hold it beside our core thesis, preservation rather than invention, we see something else. A school text ties ethics to survival. It treats wisdom not as novelty, but as inheritance. It repeatedly frames the words as precious, because they are old. The instructions of an old man are precious, you should comply with them. And it speaks again and again with the calm insistence that life is fragile, that fate can shift, that arrogance rebounds, that violence returns to the hand that throws it. Even without repeating lines, we can feel the tone. The world is not fully controllable. The best a person can do is align themselves with a pattern of right behaviour, because the river of life can change course, and the bank can be wet, and the foot can slip. In this sense, a school tablet is an archive of a society's self-preservation, not the preservation of buildings, but the preservation of conduct, the preservation of what makes a city livable after disaster. And that is where the lost book theme deepens, because the most important knowledge a civilization preserves is not always technical, it is social. How to cooperate, how to speak, how to restrain appetite, how to build trust, how to avoid the spiral of quarrels that can tear a community apart. If we allow a speculative reading, we can ask, what if Mesopotamian flood traditions were not only about water, but about collapse? What if the flood became a symbol for any overwhelming force that makes society dissolve? War, famine, migration, political upheaval. In that case, Ziusudra's name in a wisdom text is not incidental. It is a reminder. Survival is not just building a boat. It is building a way of living that can endure after the waters recede. And Enki, in this broader frame, becomes not only the revealer of a flood plan, but the archetype of transmitted wisdom, the one who carries the me, the ordinances of civilization, and distributes. The school tradition preserves what the temple tradition sanctifies and what the royal tradition collects, and because it is copied by students year after year, it can outlast dynasties. Now we approach a final contrast, one that helps us understand why some records feel unwanted, not because they are secret, but because their survival challenges the idea that civilization is born fully formed. On one side, clay, portable, copyable, fragile, but endlessly reproducible. On the other side, stone, monumental, heavy, meant to last, and meant to declare a single version of order. Between them lies the tension at the heart of Mesopotamian memory, and nowhere is that tension clearer than in the great steel of law. Law on stone, myth on clay, two ways power tries to last. There are two kinds of endurance in the ancient world. One is heavy, it stands upright, it dares weather, it insists on being seen, it speaks in a voice that expects obedience, and it chooses hardness, basalt, diorite, stone, because it wants to outlive the hands that shaped it. The other kind of endurance is quieter. It fits on a lap. It can be stacked in a room, carried across a courtyard, borrowed by a student, recopied by a tired scribe late in the day. It survives not by resisting damage, but by accepting it, because it can be made again. Stone is authority, clay is tradition. And when you place them beside one another, you begin to see why certain records might feel as if they were not meant to be preserved, because each medium preserves a different kind of truth. A monumental law stele declares, in a single object, a single version of order. A clay tablet tradition preserves many versions of memory, and it does not always agree with the official story. In the Louvre, the Code of Hammurabi stands as one of the most famous monuments of the ancient Near East, a tall stele inscribed in cuneiform, topped by a carved scene in which the king receives legitimacy from a divine figure. Even if you never read a line of the laws themselves, the message is clear: this order comes from above, and it will stand. Mainstream scholarship reads the law stele as a monumental statement of kingship and justice, less a day-to-day legal manual than a proclamation of what a king claims to be, a guarantor of order, a channel of divine authorization, a stabilizer of society. The text itself is complex, and the stele's discovery history tells its own story. It was found at Susa, far from Babylon, carried away as booty in antiquity, and then recovered by modern excavation. Here again, preservation is shaped by disruption. A later power takes the monument. The monument survives because it is taken, and the meaning of that survival is double. On the one hand, it shows that rulers wanted their words to last. On the other hand, it shows that later rulers could relocate those words, repurpose them, and make them part of a different story. If the flood traditions and Enki compositions represent a world where knowledge is inherited, the lore Slee represents a world where knowledge is declared. It is not whispered from the Abzu, it is carved, public, fixed. And yet even here, the record is not as stable as it pretends, because the stele's presence in Susa is already proof that permanence can be interrupted, stone can be moved, authority can be stolen, the eternal voice can be carried into exile. Now consider what this does to our investigation. A title like The Lost Book of Enki suggests suppressed texts, records that threaten the official narrative. But in Mesopotamia, the official narrative is not always fought by erasing the alternative. Sometimes it is fought by competing with it. A king erects a monument that says, "This is the order." Meanwhile, scribes keep copying older stories that say order has collapsed before, and it can collapse again. The flood swept over, kingship returned, the world is restored, but restoration implies prior loss. Stone wants to end the argument. Clay allows the argument to continue across generations. And this difference helps explain why Enki's tradition, associated with wisdom, deep time, and survival through catastrophe, could persist even when political theology shifted. Because clay doesn't require permission from a single king. Clay only requires a scribe and a curriculum. The overlooked detail here is not a hidden passage in the laws, it is the contrast of mediums. If a society truly wants a record to be preserved in one definitive form, it chooses stone and public display. If a society preserves a record through copying, it accepts variation, fragment, and the slow drift of tradition. So the lost book may be lost precisely because it belongs to clay, not stone. Because it was never meant to be a single frozen proclamation. It was meant to be recopied, and anything that relies on copying can disappear if copying slows. This brings us to the last turn before synthesis. Because we have followed flood stories through Nippur, Sippar, and Nineveh, we have seen Enki as organizer of the world's functions. We have watched how texts survive as constellations of witnesses. We have observed how school tablets preserve ethical continuity, and we have set stone authority beside clay memory. Now we must ask, gently, what kind of book we have been building without noticing. What is the shape of the evidence taken together? And what interpretations are responsible, and what interpretations are possible without turning possibility into certainty? 3 readings of the lost book: myth, encoded wisdom, or archive memory. If you lay these materials out in your mind like objects on a table, you begin to see a pattern, not a single text, a repeated structure, a hinge that keeps reappearing. A world is organized, a rupture comes. A wise figure preserves continuity through instruction. A new order follows. In the Sumerian king list tradition, the rupture is marked with a stark line about the flood, followed by the return of kingship. In the Sumerian flood tradition, the rupture is a divine plan, disclosed by Enki to a human who becomes the carrier of survival. In the old Babylonian Atrahasis tradition, the same mechanism appears in Akkadian clothing, shaped by different theological emphasis, but still dependent on the disclosure of knowledge. In the Neo-Assyrian Gilgamesh tradition, the flood story becomes testimony inside a philosophical epic, preserved by an imperial library that both protects and standardizes. In Enki and the World Order, the emphasis shifts from catastrophe to structure. Enki is portrayed as the custodian of functions, the one who organizes the world as if civilization were a set of assignable roles. In scribal instruction traditions, wisdom is treated as inherited, precious because it is old, and tied to figures associated with deep time, names that echo the flood survivor's identity. None of this proves a single sensational conclusion, but it does justify a serious question. Why does this tradition keep returning to inheritance? Why does it keep framing civilization as restoration? This is where a careful synthesis offers 3 interpretations, each with real strengths, each with honest limits. The first is the symbolic reading. In this view, the flood is mythic language for the experience of fragility, cities fall, rivers destroy, empires collapse. The flood represents the overwhelming force that resets human life. Enki's warning becomes the symbol of wisdom, the idea that there is always a way to endure if one aligns with knowledge and piety. Kingship descending from heaven is not a literal claim of objects falling from the sky, it is an expression of legitimacy, a metaphor that makes political order feel anchored in something beyond human dispute. This reading explains why the stories were so useful, so copyable, so enduring. It also explains why versions change, symbols are adaptable. But the symbolic reading has its own overlooked difficulty. Symbols still have to come from somewhere, and the remarkable consistency of certain structures, warning, boat, measured duration, birds, sacrifice, across centuries, suggests that the tradition was not endlessly fluid. It had an internal discipline. It was preserved with care. Symbols here behave like records. The second interpretation is the encoded wisdom reading. In this view, the narratives function as containers for practical and philosophical knowledge: how to read time, how to measure, how to organise labour, how to maintain social ethics, how to rebuild after disaster. The gods are not characters in the modern entertainment sense, they are personifications of forces and institutions. Enki represents the deep intelligence beneath visible order, the craft knowledge, the water management wisdom, the scribal expertise, the capacity to plan ahead. The flood becomes a teaching tool for preparedness and humility. Catastrophe comes, and the one who survives is the one who listens, who obeys instruction, who builds before the storm arrives. This reading aligns well with the scribal and administrative culture that produced and preserved these texts. But it too has limits. It can become too tidy. It can turn every myth into a straightforward manual, and that does not do justice to the genuine religious experience in the texts, the awe, the devotion, the ritual logic that is not reducible to practical advice. The third interpretation is the archive memory reading. In this view, the texts preserve cultural memory of real ruptures, perhaps multiple, perhaps layered, filtered through the worldview of ancient Mesopotamia. The flood might not be a single global event, but it could preserve memory of extreme floods, regional disasters, or the repeated reality of inundation on the river plain. The king list division between before and after could reflect a deep sense that the world has already been reset once, that dynasties are not continuous, and that legitimacy depends on reconnecting to a chain that has been broken. In this reading, the lost book of Enki becomes the imagined source behind the surviving fragments, a body of tradition that once existed more fully and now survives in partial form. This interpretation honours the way ancient scribes framed their own world, as inheritance, as restoration, as continuity pulled from the deep. But it must remain cautious, because we cannot leap from cultural memory to literal historical documentation without direct corroboration. The tablet record is fragmentary. It is mediated by copying. The oldest versions we possess are already later than the earliest events they describe, and Mesopotamian texts do not separate history and theology the way modern scholarship does. So what can we say responsibly after following the evidence? We can say that the lost book is not a single missing tablet. We can say that the tradition around Enki is deeply concerned with transmission of decisions, of destinies, of instructions, of functions, of survivable order. We can say that the flood functions as a boundary marker between eras, preserved even in official king lists, suggesting that rupture is part of Mesopotamian self-understanding. And we can say that preservation itself, copying, archiving, teaching, was the mechanism by which these records endured. Now the title's final tension remains: records they didn't want preserved, If we avoid melodrama, we can translate that into the most historically plausible framing. Records that were not always aligned with the needs of later authority, stories that preserved divine disagreement, traditions that admitted collapse, narratives that implied that the present world was not the first world. And that, in turn, leads to the last question of implication. If the Sumerians repeatedly framed civilization as restoration, and if Enki's role repeatedly centres on transmission of knowledge, then what does that imply about how we should understand the origins of complex society, at least as the Sumerians themselves wanted to remember it, a quiet shelf that still holds the question? Return, in your mind, to the first tablet, not the grand prism of kings, not the basalt stele of law, not the royal library tablet from an Assyrian capital, but the broken clay fragment, cool to the eye, rough to the imagination, carrying only the lower portion of a much longer composition, a tablet that survived because it fell into earth, a tablet that endured because it was buried, a tablet that speaks of cities before the flood, and of a plan, and of a disclosure, and of a measured storm. In the museum case, its missing top is not dramatic, it is simply absent. And that absence is perhaps the most honest ending for a story like this, because the deeper you go into Mesopotamian tradition, the more you realise that certainty is not the gift these texts offer. The gift they offer is continuity, a sense that words can carry a world, a sense that what is most valuable is what can be transmitted through disaster, through dynastic change, through the slow drift of languages, through the moving of monuments, through the breaking of tablets. If you came to this story expecting a single lost book, a single forbidden volume with a clear outline, you may feel the ground soften under that expectation, but something else may take its place, a quieter thought, that the book was never a bound object, it was a tradition of copying. And if that is true, then the question becomes less about hidden conspiracies and more about human choices. Someone chose to write. Someone chose to copy. Someone chose to file the tablet in a room that later collapsed. Someone chose, centuries later, to lift it out of the earth and assign it a number and place it behind glass. And across all those choices, one pattern endured: the idea that knowledge is carried, not invented, that civilization is restored, not born in a single moment, that order can be lost, and that it can return. If Enki remains ambiguous, and he should, then let his ambiguity remain the right kind. Not a claim of aliens, not a dismissal of mystery, but a disciplined openness to the possibility that ancient people were preserving memories in the only form they trusted: ritual, narrative, and clay. And as you rest, you can let the final question sit where it belongs, without urgency, without pressure, without needing an answer tonight. What if the oldest cities on the river plain did not think of themselves as pioneers? What if they thought of themselves as inheritors? And if they were inheritors, then what exactly did they believe they had received? If this story settled gently into your night, and if you feel like sharing, leave a quiet comment with where you listened from and what time it was for you, another small record placed into the flow so that something of this moment is preserved. Settle in gently. There is a moment just before sleep takes you when your mind becomes like a quiet storeroom at dusk, dim, calm, and strangely orderly without trying. Tonight, we stand in that threshold with one careful idea, held lightly so it can drift rather than cling. Somewhere in the surviving records of ancient Mesopotamia, the name Enki moves like a current beneath the surface, not always visible, not always centred, but present, especially when the world is being arranged, measured, and restored after it breaks. And if you've been listening to this story, you already know what it is not. It is not a single book that can be lifted from a shelf, opened to a first page, and read cleanly to the end. In the world of clay tablets, what survives is rarely complete. What survives is scattered, fragments, joins, copies, and echoes. Yet the pattern still feels coherent. The way a river remains a river even when its banks shift. A flood story survives on broken clay. It speaks of cities that existed before the waters came, of decisions made beyond human hearing, and of a warning that passes from a knowing power to a single listener. The storm has a counted duration, and then the sun returns. A survivor emerges, offers what is owed, and the world resumes, changed but not erased. Another record preserves an official line so brief it feels like a sealed door the flood swept over. And then, without drama, kingship descends again, not invented from nothing, returned, as if authority itself was something restored after interruption. And elsewhere, a long composition speaks of order, as though order were a set of functions that can be assigned and carried, powers placed into hands, decisions weighed, roles distributed. In that way of thinking, civilization is not a sudden spark. It is a practice of arrangement, a steady labour of keeping things in their right places. You do not need to decide what any of this proves. It is enough, tonight, to notice the mood that connects it all. The mood is not triumph, it is preservation. In these traditions, the most important act is rarely the first moment of invention. It is the act of keeping, of restoring boundaries after water has blurred them, of returning days and months to their proper rhythm, of re-establishing a livable order after something overwhelming has passed through. This is why the idea of a lost book of Enki lingers, not because we can point to one vanished object and name the exact moment it disappeared, but because the surviving pieces suggest a deeper shelf beneath the visible shelf, a layer of remembered order, repeated across generations, passing through different cities and languages, never fully disappearing, only breaking, scattering, and reappearing in new hands. And perhaps that is what it means in an ancient world for records to be unwanted. Not a bonfire, not a dramatic purge, just the quiet reality that what is copied survives, and what is not copied fades, sometimes by accident, sometimes by changing needs, sometimes because empires prefer one version of a story and allow others to drift into silence. In that slow process, a book can be lost without anyone ever touching it. It can simply dissolve into fragments. And the fragments that remain, broken at the top, broken at the side, still legible where the wedge is held, become a different kind of invitation. Not an invitation to certainty, but to careful attention. What was written above the break? What details were once present and are now gone? What instructions were once spoken and are now only implied? Let those questions soften. Let them become gentle, not sharp. Let them sit like a lamp turned low, light enough to soothe, not bright enough to keep you awake. In a moment, we'll let the narration loosen further and ease into the outer loop, slow, steady, sleep-friendly, where the same images return like water returning to stillness, a clay fragment that refused to vanish, a record that admits a rupture, a name associated with deep waters and deep memory, and the quiet feeling that civilization, in its own telling, was never only created, it was preserved, it was restored, and it was carried forward patiently through whatever came. Let the image return, slowly without effort, a small piece of baked clay resting under soft light, its surface crowded with wedge marks, each one pressed by a hand that is no longer here. The tablet does not ask you to believe, it does not ask you to argue, it simply remains, and in remaining, it suggests a quiet truth, that some things endure not because they are protected, but because they are repeated, copied, carried, and somehow placed back into the world again. In the old stories, the flood comes as a decision, a storm of days counted carefully, and then a silence as the water settles. In the museum, the flood becomes something else. It becomes a line where the clay breaks. It becomes a missing portion where the upper text should have been. It becomes a gap that invites the mind to reach upward, then to relax, and accept that the gap is part of what survives. Because a broken record is still a record. And if the Sumerians left us anything, it may be this habit of seeing continuity where others would see only interruption. A city falls, and later a city rises. A dynasty ends, and later kingship returns. A tablet shatters, and still the surviving third carries enough to hint at the whole. You can hold that thought as lightly as you like. What matters is not solving it tonight. What matters is the feeling of an ancient world that did not describe itself as brand new, but as restored again and again by people who believed that knowledge could be passed through darkness, the way a flame passes from one wick to another. And perhaps this is why Enki in those old lines feels less like a distant god and more like a function in the story of memory itself, not a proof of anything outside the texts, simply a presence associated with the deep place where things are kept, the Abzu beneath the earth, the storehouse beneath the visible world, the quiet reservoir where instruction waits until it is needed. Imagine that deep place now, not as a literal chamber, but as an idea, a place where the measures are kept, where the names are kept, where the boundaries are kept, where the old sequence of days and months waits to be resumed after disorder. In the Sumerian imagination, order is something that can be lost, but it is also something that can be re-established. The mind can rest in that rhythm. Loss, then return. Silence, then recitation. Flood, then land. And if you find yourself drifting, you can let the words become like water moving through reeds, slow, repetitive, gentle, without sharp edges. A record is made. A record is stored. A record is copied. A record survives. And somewhere between the copying and the survival, the record changes, not in its purpose, but in its clothing. The language shifts. The city names shift. The empires shift. Yet the outline remains, like a riverbed that still guides the flow even after the flood has altered its banks. So the lost book becomes less like a missing object and more like a trail through Nippur's buried shelves, through Sippa's sunlit memory of lore and story, through Nineveh's collected library of empire, through the classroom where a young scribe learns that the words of an old man are precious, through the monument where a king carves order into stone, through the quiet fact that even stone can be carried away, and even clay can endure by being hidden. And if they didn't want it preserved ever meant anything in that world, it may have meant something very simple, that no one ever fully controls what lasts. Not kings, not priests, not empires. Time chooses in its own slow way. The earth chooses. Fire chooses. Chance chooses. And yet human hands still choose too, each time a scribe decides to press the stylus down and leave a mark that can be read long after the breath has gone. Now you can let the question soften. What if the Sumerians preserved knowledge rather than invented it? You do not need to answer. You only need to notice how gently the thought fits into the larger rhythm of their records, that civilization is a restoration, that memory is a craft, and that survival belongs to those who keep the instructions close. If sleep is near, let it come the way water returns to stillness, without demand, without hurry. And if wakefulness lingers, let it linger like the last light in a museum gallery, shining on a tablet that refuses to disappear. Somewhere in the clay, a voice still speaks, not loudly, not urgently, just enough to remind you that the past is not finished. It is stored, it is copied, it is carried, and in the quiet it continues.